You begin with a familiar confidence, the belief that knowledge secures truth. You assume that when an idea feels clear, it must also be correct, and when a conclusion appears coherent, it must rest on firm ground. Yet this confidence dissolves when you pause long enough to inspect its source. You notice that you rarely question the mind that forms your certainties. You only question the ideas themselves. This raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps certainty does not arise from truth but from habit. Al-Ghazali confronted this issue at the beginning of his inquiry. He observed that the mind can feel certain even when it is mistaken. You then find yourself asking, if certainty can exist without truth, what exactly is being trusted when you trust your thoughts? Al-Ghazali lived in an environment shaped by philosophical rigor and intellectual dispute. In Baghdad, scholars argued through precise definitions, jurists structured entire systems of reasoning, and theologians built elaborate frameworks to defend their claims. Each group believed its conclusions were reliable because its methods were refined. Yet Al-Ghazali noticed something deeper. Even the most disciplined arguments depend on assumptions the mind never questions. In a world rich with theories, the most important question remained untouched. How does the mind verify itself? Al-Ghazali eventually recognized that every form of knowledge rests on a foundation the mind cannot guarantee. Logical arguments depend on premises accepted without proof. Sensory evidence relies on perceptions that can mislead. Even inherited teachings require trust in the very faculty that evaluates them. Once this realization emerged, the stability of knowledge faltered. You recognize the same tension within yourself. When you examine your convictions closely, you see that they depend on the mind's internal operations that assume their own reliability without verification. This produces a quiet crisis. If the instrument of knowing is untested, how can its products be certain? The question persists: what remains when every claim to certainty is suspended? Reason offers structure, clarity, and consistency. Yet it cannot prove the validity of the assumptions on which it rests. Al-Ghazali understood this clearly. Reason can demonstrate that one conclusion follows logically from another, but it cannot determine whether the first premise is true. It can show coherence, not reality. You begin to see that reason functions as an organizer of thought rather than a revealer of truth. It sorts, compares, and arranges, but it does not disclose the essence of what it handles. When you notice this, reason becomes a useful tool rather than an unquestioned authority. The mind can think accurately without knowing whether it thinks truthfully. Al-Ghazali proposed that understanding requires more than intellectual refinement. It requires the purification of perception. He described the heart not as an emotional center but as the inner faculty through which truth becomes visible when freed from distortion. Thoughts, desires, fears, and preferences can cloud this faculty, preventing clear perception. You begin to observe this in yourself. When you want an answer to be true, thought bends toward it. When you fear an outcome, your reasoning subtly avoids it. These distortions operate quietly. They do not announce themselves. Yet they shape your conclusions. Al-Ghazali's insight becomes clear. Truth appears when the inner lens becomes transparent. But if clarity depends on the state of the heart, how much of what you call understanding is actually a reflection of your condition rather than reality? Once Al-Ghazali recognized the instability of knowledge, doubt became a method rather than an obstacle. He questioned not only what he believed but also how he believed. This form of doubt did not seek destruction. It sought purification. It removed layers of assumption until only what could withstand scrutiny remained. You begin to experience the shift. Doubt stops feeling like a threat and becomes a tool of clarity. When you question your own conclusions, you discover which ones genuinely survive examination. This process does not weaken understanding. It strengthens it by removing what was never solid. Yet a paradox remains. If every belief can be doubted, can any belief ever become truly secure? In the depth of his crisis, Al-Ghazali noticed that insight sometimes emerges without deliberate reasoning. Understanding appears suddenly, not as a constructed conclusion but as a direct recognition. Only afterward does thought gather itself to interpret what has been seen. You have likely experienced this as well. A realization arrives before you can explain it. The explanation follows, but it is secondary. This suggests that the origin of understanding may lie beyond discursive thought. Thought clarifies what awareness has already recognized. This does not diminish reason, it assigns reason its proper place. The mind becomes a translator of insight, not its creator. As Al-Ghazali continued observing the movements of his own mind, he realized that silence plays a crucial role in understanding. Silence is not the absence of thinking, it is the suspension of unnecessary mental activity. When the mind stops reacting, projecting, and interpreting, a different form of clarity emerges. You begin to recognize this in your own experience. When you pause your mental commentary, even briefly, perception becomes cleaner. Questions remain, yet they feel lighter, no longer burdened by the urgency of conclusion. Silence allows the mind to rest in its natural state, free from the distortions created by constant activity. Al-Ghazali treated silence as a cognitive discipline. He would withhold immediate judgments, allowing reality to reveal itself instead of forcing it into predefined categories. This approach does not reject reasoning. It prepares the mind to reason from a place of clarity rather than compulsion. You start to see that silence is not passive. It is an active form of inquiry that prevents interference from the ego's demands. The question arises quietly. If silence reveals what thinking hides, how much of knowledge is obscured by the constant need to think? To Al-Ghazali, internal stillness was not an emotion or a mood. It was the disciplined positioning of awareness. It meant observing thought without identifying with it, allowing ideas to arise and dissolve without interference. Through this practice, he discovered that the mind becomes transparent when it ceases to grasp. You begin exploring this in yourself. When you watch your thoughts without attaching to them, you notice that they lose their authority. A thought is simply an event in consciousness, not a command. This recognition creates space. The mind continues to produce impressions, judgments, and interpretations, but you no longer feel compelled to follow each one. In this state, clarity emerges naturally. You are not forcing understanding. You are allowing perception to settle. What remains is not an answer constructed through logic but an unobstructed view of the situation. It becomes clear that insight requires two conditions: the quieting of mental noise and the stabilization of awareness. Al-Ghazali found that when awareness stabilizes, knowledge becomes grounded. It is no longer shaped by preference or fear. It becomes aligned with the nature of what is seen. Yet even this realization leads to a further question. If understanding arises when the self steps aside, what role does the self play in knowing at all? Al-Ghazali observed that much of the confusion surrounding knowledge arises from the assumption that the self is the knower. But when he examined this assumption closely, he found that the self is not stable. It changes with context, emotion, and perception. A changing self cannot serve as a reliable foundation for truth. You begin to notice this fluidity within yourself. Your beliefs shift with experience. Your judgments fluctuate with mood. Your interpretations vary depending on what you hope or fear. If the self changes, the knowledge anchored in the self also becomes unstable. This realization does not produce despair. It produces clarity. It reveals that the self is part of the process of knowing, not the ground of it. When you release the self from its imagined role as the center of understanding, a new form of perception becomes possible. Instead of viewing knowledge as something owned or constructed, you see it as something revealed when the mind is quiet and the heart is transparent. This shift dissolves the search for certainty into a deeper insight. Clarity does not come from securing the self, it comes from reducing its interference. Yet this insight raises a final question. If the self is not the source of knowing, what is the nature of the knowing that remains? Al-Ghazali eventually recognized that behind thought, emotion, and self-image lies a fundamental awareness that does not change. This awareness does not argue, conclude, or interpret. It simply knows. It perceives the movements of the mind without becoming entangled in them. Once he distinguished awareness from the activities of the mind, the path to certainty changed direction. You begin to perceive this distinction within yourself. There is the thought, and there is the one who notices the thought. There is the reaction, and there is the one who sees the reaction. This seeing does not depend on what is seen. It remains constant while everything within the mind changes. From this perspective, understanding becomes less about constructing accurate ideas and more about returning to the clarity of awareness itself. Awareness does not seek certainty, it reveals it. It does not produce truth, it recognizes it. When this becomes clear, reasoning takes its proper place, not as the source of knowledge but as its servant. Yet even this insight does not finalize the inquiry. Awareness is stable, but interpreting its clarity remains a task for the mind. And so the final question appears. If awareness is the ground of knowing, what happens when the mind finally rests in that ground? You arrive at a point where the mind recognizes its limits. It no longer demands that reality conform to its categories. It no longer seeks certainty through argument. Instead, it acknowledges that its role is secondary. Thought becomes a tool rather than a master. In this recognition, silence appears not as emptiness, but as the natural state of a mind freed from compulsion. In silence, awareness stands unobstructed. Truth is not something you claim, it is something you no longer obscure. What remains is not an answer but the capacity to see clearly. The inquiry dissolves. The seeker becomes quiet. And in that quiet, understanding stands on its own.